everybody, welcome to History Doodles. Today we're looking at one of the most heroic and mind-blowing moments from the Napoleonic Wars, and that's Marshal Ney's retreat in Russia. I want to talk about what made this such a rallying point for the French army and why it's remembered as one of the most heroic things in basically history generally. So without further ado, let's get into it. So this is Marshal Ney's retreat in Russia, created by the French painter Adolphe Yvon in 1856. The center of this masterpiece features none other than Marshal Ney, and the men around him are the remnants of his rear guard, which is protecting Napoleon Bonaparte's retreat from Moscow in 1812. So here Napoleon had put Ney in a really bad spot. Earlier that year, Napoleon, the Emperor of France, assembled the largest army in Europe up to that European history up to that point. He had around 600,000 men with him at the start of this campaign, most of whom would die in Russia. Numbers differ, but somewhere around only 10% of them would actually make it back home. The Russians knew that they didn't stand a chance against Napoleon in a direct confrontation. Napoleon was a strategic genius, so he was very rarely defeated. So the Russians opted for a scorched earth approach, which basically planned to draw the French forces further and further into the vast, desolate steppes of Russia and kind of stretch the French army's supply lines and deny them a chance to have a decisive battle. This culminated with Napoleon making it all the way to Moscow. But rather than surrender, the Russians burned their capital city and refused to negotiate. Napoleon waited in Moscow for weeks, hoping for a negotiation and a treaty, but instead, the Russian Tsar Alexander told him to kick rocks and basically waited for the Russian winter to come. And when it did come, it was an abject disaster for the French. They were not equipped for the freezing temperatures, which on its own took countless lives. But in addition to the temperatures, which dropped to below negative 35 degrees, the French army had no food, there were outbreaks of typhus, and they would be stalked on the retreat by Russian Cossacks, which were basically mounted horsemen from the Russian steppes. I could talk for half an hour just about how shitty the situation was for the French army, and the stories are absolutely horrific. But just note that by November, at the time of Ney's retreat, which I'm trying to get to, these men were absolute shells of human beings. So as Napoleon is withdrawing from Moscow and trying to take what's left of his army out of Russia, he stops at Smolensk along the way and departs there on November 15th. Since his 100,000 men that were left at this point couldn't all walk together on these frozen, snowy roads at once, the Grande Armée kind of moved like a snake with a head and a tail. The rest of Napoleon's forces would follow him over the next couple days until they reached the next town, which was going to be Orsha, where they would regroup and then depart again. After Napoleon left Smolensk, though, the Russian general Miloradovich came in and basically blocked the road behind him. And then he posted his Cossacks on the wings so that no one could get around. Here, Napoleon was cut off from his three commanders and their men, Prince Eugene, Devoe, and in the rear guard, Marshal Ney. The first to run into Miloradovich's trap was Eugene, who was defeated on October 16th by the Russians and barely managed to survive until nightfall. And when night fell, he slipped away under the cover of darkness into a nearby woods and actually was, attempting some sort of escape. In the woods, Eugene and his men were recognized by Russian sentries, and Eugene came up with a strategy to send one of his Polish colonels to go talk to the Russians and tell them that he was on a secret mission, that they were Russians themselves. They somehow bought this ruse, and Eugene managed to slip away past the sentries and rejoin Napoleon further down the road. After learning about Eugene's maneuver, Miloradovich moved his troops to catch up with Napoleon and Eugene, but that had the unintended consequence of allowing the French general Devoe to catch up with him as well. So now Napoleon, Eugene, and Devoe are all together with most of what is left of the French army, and the Russians are closing in on their position. So they decide that they have to leave immediately, and rather than waiting for their rear guard with Marshal Ney, because if they just waited any longer, they could die out in the frozen steppes, rather than making some sort of a defensive line at Orsha. When they arrived at Orsha, Napoleon would be very distraught about leaving Ney behind, reportedly blaming Devoe for the situation and saying that he would give all 300 million francs in the vault back in the Tuileries to get him back. Now, meanwhile, back in Smolensk, Ney is following orders to torch the city and didn't even realize that Miloradovich's trap was ahead of him and that he had essentially been left for dead. And just to show how brutal this conflict was, after Smolensk is torched, they had to leave all of their wounded men in the city, and they left them with a note written in 3 languages pleading for mercy for these men. Those who fell into the hands of the Russian Cossacks were often treated horribly, and in some cases tortured or stripped naked and left into the barren, frozen wastes of the Russian steppe. It was a horror show. On the 18th, Ney departed Smolensk and runs into Miloradovich. The Russian general was really pissed off that he had let Eugene and Davout slip behind him, and he was determined not to make the same mistake 3 times. Miloradovich had superior numbers, and he offered Ney an honorable surrender. But Ney replied that a Marshal of France never surrenders. Ney had around 6,000 men with him at this time, and he launched a bold attack at the Russian position. His men charged through knee-deep snow with their bayonets and rifles, but they couldn't make it to the Russian cannons and infantry lines. They tried a second charge later in the day, but that was also pushed back. And though both were surprisingly effective given their situation, they were pushed back and ultimately had to wait for nightfall, kind of like Eugene. With a huge chunk of his remaining forces taken out, Ney had to come up with a plan to get his men out of this. So that night, with his 3,000 or so remaining men, they set up fires in a camp to make it look like they were staying for the night, and then later in the evening slipped away and tried to find a crossing point at the Dnieper River. They found a suitable crossing point where the river had frozen over, but the ice was not exactly thick enough to hold all of the men, their guns, and their horses all at the same time. And the opposite side of the bank was a steep, frozen wall, basically. A contemporary source wrote about this crossing, saying, quote, "Ney made an audacious decision to lead everyone to the Dnieper, hoping to cross the opposite bank of the ice. His choice left soldiers and officers alike astonished. Despite their incredulous gazes, Ney declared that if no one supported him, he would go alone, and that the soldiers knew he was not making empty threats. When the fortunate few reached the opposite shore and believed themselves saved, they had to climb yet another steep slope to reach the shore, resulting in many falling back onto the ice. Of the 3,000 soldiers who accompanied Ney, 2,200 drowned during the crossing." End quote. The few men that managed to make this crossing found a small, undisturbed village on the other side, and it allowed them some food and a place to rest for a minute. But they obviously couldn't stay long because the Cossacks were on their tail. The following day, they set up on the opposite side of the Dnieper and followed it towards Orsha, but realized the Cossacks had caught up with them. His men set up a defensive position in some woods to fend them off, and then when they made that stand, they continued to march through this knee-deep snow. His men at this point are exhausted, demoralized, starving, and ready to surrender. And Ney famously told them, "Those who get through this will show that they have their balls hung by steel wire." I don't know what that means exactly, but I think it's pretty awesome. They marched all through the 19th and chased by Cossacks, freezing and starving to death, and miraculously, they made it to Orsha at 3 a.m. on November 20th. The sight of Ney and his men was the first bit of good news that these French soldiers had received in a long time, and it became a rallying cry for the remainder to keep pushing on. A man in Napoleon's staff described the moment saying, "Never has a victory caused such a sensation." Now, in this painting that we started with, you can start to realize the full scope of what's going on. You can see a wagon of wounded, dying men hanging on by dear life, and in front of them is a path clearing the way. And you can see stragglers following the army. These are the poor Russian people who actually had to endure this disaster, and they suffered as much or more than anyone else. And in the background of the Cossacks, closing in on the French, with Smolensk burning behind them. And then calmly, defiantly is Ney, the last man in the retreating line of soldiers of the Grande Armée. Thank you so much for watching to the end. I hope you learned something and had as much fun as I did putting it together. If you're into liking and subscribing, it'd be awesome if you could do that, and I hope to see you next time.